Hi, everyone. I am really happy to be having a conversation today with Dr. Joerg Rieger. Joerg, if you're not familiar with him, is the Distinguished Professor of Theology and the Cal Turner Chancellor's Chair of Wesleyan Studies. He's also the founding director of the Wendland Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt Divinity School, just over the other side of the mountains in Nashville, Tennessee. Previously, Dr. Rieger was the Wendland Cook Endowed Professor of Constructive Theology at Perkins School of Theology in Southern Methodist University. He received an MDiv from, and I'm going to try to pronounce this, the Theologische Hochschule. Joerg, I think I did it better when we were coaching earlier. Can you tell us where you really went to school?
Theologische Hochschule Reutlingen, but good effort, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And a THM from Duke Divinity School and a PhD in Religion and Ethics from Duke University. Now, Joerg has been an author and editor of 22 books and over 140 academic articles. And for more than 2 decades, he's worked together to bring theology and the struggles for justice and liberation that mark our age together. His work addresses the relation of theology and public life, reflecting on the misuse of power in religion, politics, and economics. His main interest is in the developments and movements that bring about change and the positive contributions of religion and theology. His constructive work in theology draws on a wide range of historical and contemporary traditions with a concern for the manifestations of the divine amid the pressures of everyday life. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome, Joerg.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be with you, and I'm really glad you're picking on that topic because sometimes people think, Rieger's just sort of either a social critic or an activist or maybe somebody who's thinking about social issues and ethics a lot. But it's this question of the divine presence that really intrigues me.
Absolutely. And we're going to have time for all of it today because I think it is good for those of us who are oriented towards spirituality and spiritual practice to also have a critical mind and consider what's really going on in this day and age. But conversely, I think it's important for those of us who are in the trenches of working for social change to ask the question of, yeah, where is the divine? How do we sense into spirit with all of our senses? How do we renew ourselves when the struggle is really getting us down? Um, and that's why, while we'll be covering a whole variety of issues, we're centering around one of your more recent releases, Theology in the Capitalocene, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. And
Right here, there you go.
that very one, ding, yes. And for those of us who, might not be familiar with the term that, I don't know if you exactly coined it, but it's, something that's kind of unique to you. What is the Capitalocene?
So I didn't coin it. Colleague of mine, Jason Moore, who's a sociologist and historian, coined it. But the basic point of the Capitalocene is this is the age in which not only capitalism rules everything, but it's a geological age where the forces that we see shaping the planet have to be named. And the thing is, this is what probably people are more familiar with. Everybody's talking about the Anthropocene these days, right? We know the Holocene was the last 11,000 years since the Ice Age. Now we live in the Anthropocene, a lot of people are saying, which is the time when 8 billion people are shaping the future of the planet. That's one way to look at it. Those of us who argue for the Capitalocene are saying it's not 8 billion people in the same way, but it's really structures that put some people at the very top. There's always a handful of people that not only own the majority of the wealth in the world, but also the power. And so this is what the Capitalocene is talking about. The reason why I'm talking about it as a theologian is because I think this Capitalocene thing is shaping us all the way to the core. So it's not just a matter of what shapes the economy, what shapes the ecology, what shapes politics, but what is it that shapes our faith, our spirituality, our being, our relationships. So that's why I get into it as a theologian. Theology in the Capitalocene then is talking about what's really happening to us, always with an eye towards what we can do about it.
Absolutely. And, I think that there are these really important connections between the capitalist scene and the ways that capital is forming everything about us And this idea of the Anthropocene and looking at sort of the more deep time ecological changes that we're experiencing. Toward the beginning of your book, you say the biggest challenge to the dominant system is the deep transnational solidarity of people on the planet that can no longer be pushed aside or misclassified as minorities to be integrated. People on the planet can constitute solid majorities everywhere. Can you unpack what you mean by that?
Yes, this is really, I think, the core of the book, this question of solidarity. Can we think about what's going on in terms of resistance as something that's not just popping up here or there, but really a broad-based solidarity that includes, you know, not only people, but also the planet. So this is human and other than human together. And that's what the system is most afraid of. In the US, we oftentimes think about resistance in terms of either small groups speaking truth to power, minorities speaking out, minority interests. We talk about the marginalized, thinking there are some people on the margins. Uh, what we're talking about in the Capitalocene is that 99% of us are not really winning this game. So even people in the middle class, that might feel like they have a better deal, and they do have a better deal, that's for sure, are ultimately part of the solidarity because they're not winning this game. In fact, even if they're doing fairly well for themselves, people in the middle, they cannot guarantee that their kids will be doing well for themselves. They cannot even guarantee that they'll make it all the way through retirement in one piece, right? So if you think about the challenges that we're facing, we need to start really, and this is one of the points of solidarity. We need to start with where the pressures are greatest, and that's, of course, in the United States, with minority communities, women, LGBTQIA plus communities, and so on. This is where you learn what the system is really up uh, doing to us, right? But at the same time, the rest of us need to realize there is something that's happening to the least of these that's really happening to the 99% of us. And of course, the 99% here is a symbolic number. It's not exact math. But keep in mind, 99% of us are people who have to work for a living, are people who ultimately, for a moment, some of us might be okay. But even the privilege that we have doesn't really give us all that much power. This is another distinction in the book to say if you confuse privilege and power, you may think too highly of where you are in the system. The
Ooh,
ultimate question really is we're all in a boat that is heading towards the abyss, and it can really hit us hard. That's what is at the root of the solidarity.
absolutely. And thing is, we're tired, a lot of us, and we're kind of wondering what the limits are of solidarity or of people power. I want to tell you about this dinner that I had the other night. I was with some beloveds and friends, and we were actually at an eco village that some friends of mine have about an hour outside of Asheville in the foothills, where they have about 40 acres. They've been very intentionally the last several years been attempting to live differently in this kind of rural mountain town, being a witness to its legacy of colonialism, really, of displacing native Cherokee population, 100 plus years ago. And they're running all kinds of amazing programming. They have this beautiful farm, they have solar energy. They're wanting to be more of an intentional community while also bringing in really amazing speakers and facilitators, people in radical theology, actually, and movement spaces. And yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and plug it since they're talking about it. It's Dreaming Stone in Roughton, as the locals pronounce it, Rutherford Tin, if you're saying all the syllables. And so, among those of us who were just sitting around for dinner, this wonderful dinner of root vegetables fresh from the garden, everyone at the table is either like a published author or an artist, a musician, an activist, a facilitator, people who, in some cases, have been in these movement spaces for, a couple decades. And we we're talking about this seemingly intractable dilemma that over the last 10, 15 years, whether we're talking about Occupy Wall Street or Standing Rock or Black Lives Matter or the recent global outcry over this genocide in progress in Gaza, that we have had some of the biggest mass human turnouts in human history. So many people getting in the streets, marching, sharing our demands, sharing what it is that we want. And what has the fruit been? Now, corporations seem to have more power than ever. We've learned nothing from the economic meltdown of 2008. Police forces are being more militarized than ever, getting increasingly bloated budgets. In my home city of Atlanta, Cop City is this, training ground atrocity that has crossover with the IDF in Israel. It's like these oppressors are really well networked together and are helping each other out to get more and more totalitarian control. And you know, it feels like our outcry is falling on deaf ears. It feels like representative democracy is a joke when these moneyed interests, including lobbyists, have bought and paid for lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. And even having a both sides seems to keep us polarized and impotent, keeping, say, people like Cornel West and Marianne Williamson and Garcia out of even the public consciousness of the upcoming presidential elections, never mind debates and ballots. And so we were all sitting around feeling fairly depressed about the possibility for mass social change. What hope do you think we have?
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, also, I really appreciate your description of this group. That sounds really fun, a group I'd love to hang with too,
We should have you out sometime. I'm
Yeah,
going to say the royal we as though I do programming at Dreaming Stone, but my friends Jay and Tevin, I think, would like to have you out sometime.
yeah, definitely. I'm game. And if you give me a reason to ride the motorcycle out there, even better.
Absolutely.
This is my daily transportation. Even it keeps my mind sane a bit. But I really want to start where you started here. We're tired, and I think that really has to be heard. So going on with activism as usual is somehow not working. I think we have to be really honest about this. This is one reason why I founded the Wendland Cook program in religion and justice, which is doing things a little differently. People might not be aware of it yet, but check us out. Our website is religionandjustice.org. One word, religionandjustice.org. And one thing that we're saying is, or I keep saying, repeating so many times now, that maybe speaking truth to power is not quite enough. Why is it? Well, because at the end of the day, you may have the truth, but they still have the power. So a lot of our protesting and even some of our organizing, some of our activism, even policy work, in a way doesn't quite work as you have described. And not just because we're not doing it well enough, but because the power isn't quite where we think it is. And this is another point of the Capitalocene. If one thinks the power is in the hand of the state, or in the hands of politicians, well, guess what's overlooked here? The fact that there is economic power, and not just the power of someone's money, but structural powers, structural channels that make even those people that seem at the very top compliant with the system. So that's politicians. You think now of religious leaders, the same thing. Pastors, for sure, are really bound by the money that comes in, right? The biggest donors, and even the biggest donors in churches are not necessarily where the buck stops, but they're beholden to a structural system where they have to follow along. And unless one addresses that, I think one can certainly rattle the bars of the cage, but the cage is still there. And so one thing that we're trying to do is really think a little bit more about that cage, not only how it is constructed, but how we can reconstruct it. And at that point, what we're doing, and this is still somewhat unique, is we're saying, for a while, it seemed like really important for religion to get aware of politics, which we are also, and we should be. I'm not talking party politics. I'm talking about the bigger political issues. But now we have to understand that religion is also part of economics, and politics is part of economics. And so we are putting these things back together again, religion, politics, and economics, saying one really has to build power, not just politically, but also economically. One thing we're talking about is economic democracy. This is another term that a lot of Americans haven't heard. We should be proud as Americans for what we've been able to do with democracy, even though that's always under attack and it's getting worse, right? You know this. But the fact that there could be economic democracy is sort of something that people don't even expect. So they think politics is about either going to the voting booth or speaking truth to power, speaking your mind, speak up, why don't you speak up? Well, if nobody listens, well,
Yeah, money
you can speak up.
talks. So
Yes.
yeah,
Oftentimes louder than words.
yeah.
And so even sort of the well-meaning, we demand that the government will do this and the state will do that and the politicians should do that. That's all important, don't get me wrong, but it
Mhm.
overlooks the fact that our lives are basically uh, so rooted in how money talks. And of course, people that go to work every day, they know that there is not really economic democracy at work. And so, for some odd reason, people spend the bulk of their waking hours in places that are not democratic without even asking a question, right? And then that gets overlooked. I mean, I talked about a structure here. Your question was, what do we do? How can we actually make a difference? That's sort of the first thing. We're tired. Well, I think we're tired because a lot of this activism hasn't necessarily quite gotten us to where we want to go. So then, what else? Well, there's a different sort of building power for us. For instance, we're working with the labor movement. That's a big one. Of course, it's a growing one now too, but also with cooperatives, worker co-ops, for instance, where in the end, people are not working for the boss, but they're working for themselves. And maybe the project that you described there, that farm could be a cooperative project too, right? Which is already a whole different way of spending your everyday labor, because that tires us out too. And so, as we reclaim some of our labor power, and with it, as we reclaim some of our creativity in the everyday, I think those are all of a sudden popping up as some resources where we're not just always investing energy, but then, we're growing vegetables and we have a great meal. We use solar power, and, we might not get immediately anything out of it. But on the other hand, it's also a good thing, that people should be proud of and really sort of give themselves some credit for. And then finally, for the theologian, the question is, um, can we actually find God there? Because that's the final problem here with the being tired. We think activism is always exerting ourselves, doing more stuff, talking louder, marching further, all that thing, without understanding that, it could actually be the place where human and divine and other than human meet, and you also get some energy out of it.
Yeah. So you're saying that, I was thinking about just that revolutionary idea of Sabbath that is, interwoven in the Hebrew tradition that Christianity inherits, of a, 7 days of rest, 7 years of rest, Jubilee economics at 49/50 years of rest. And what if we actually practiced that? What if we actually created human centered spaces, divine receptive spaces, and rest? How could that infuse our activism in a more potent way?
That's certainly one thing. You have to think about the reality of Sabbath, and the truth is, we're working around the clock, and activism in some ways makes it worse, because then you now do after hour stuff too. Of course, once you take this all back to not just labor, but a different way of working and being productive as a human being, you can say two things. One is that labor is going to be very different. That labor in itself is not going to be quite as exhausting as what you usually see. And then, of course, you can bring the rest into it too. I remember as a elementary school student in Germany, our teacher asked us, we were talking about biology and the heart, and she said, "When does the heart take a break?" Well, when you're dead, maybe, or
Oof, yeah.
when does the heart ever rest, right? And she says, well, think about it. The heart rests between each beat, right? So I mean, in other words, rest can even be built into work if we reclaim that. Rest can be built into activism. Being energized can be built into activism. So one doesn't have to think about here, let's be activist for a bit, and then we go back to the mountaintop and we do spirituality or what. But to say, activism becomes spirituality, spirituality becomes activism to some degree, but at a pace that is now not tearing anybody apart. It's not this frantic, I must save the world, but thinking, what is that rhythm that we find ourselves in, and how can we shape all of our lives, the work that we do. And then you take your activism back into the workspace too. It's not a matter of what you do well, it's also a matter of what you do Wednesday night, but maybe even more important, what you do from 9 to 5. The kinds of things that you engage in there, and you build power in a way that most people don't even see as a place for building power.
Yeah. Yeah,
So I mean, I'm pushing these things and maybe a little too quickly here,
no.
because those are all things that I feel that progressive circles are not talking about. So it's
Mhm.
not like, oh, Rieger has a couple of cute ideas and Rieger has always been a little further to the left. But no, I mean, these are things that anybody and everybody, all people of goodwill, the 99% need to take a little more seriously, because otherwise we have this false image of advocacy, activism, you name it, that ultimately can only wear us out in a system that is not bent on listening to us. It's going to get more and more frustrating, exactly the way you described. And then sort of either people drop out of activism. I see that a lot. Burnout is a real problem. Or the ones of us that are a little bit older that have done it for a couple of decades. We've done it so long, it's part of our system. We're not going to drop out, but we're going to be really tired and depressed.
Yay. Yeah, I think it's so important to consider what you're saying about like building in rest within the system. If the heart rests at every beat, how can we create more like a perpetual motion, way of moving in the world and rhythm, rather than, sort of exhausting ourselves and then having to fall back and to retreat. And yeah, I mean, as you're describing all of this, I think that there are a lot of perceptions that exist maybe in the general public and amongst people of faith in particular, that, oh, all of this is too reductively Marxist or something. You're saying that really, politics is about money, religion is really about money, money just, money and power analysis makes the world go round. Like, that's not a very enchanted world. That's not, the sort of world that I want to live in. Actually, I'll pause there. How would you respond to that sort of perception or critique?
This is maybe one of the core issues that we're not always talking about, but this reproach of stuff being Marxist, somehow that's the worst thing. The problem there, I mean, there's several problems, but the first one is, people think Marxism is a certain thing. So Marxism either is crazy activism, or state totalitarianism, or bureaucracy, all that kind of thing, atheism, all that gets, tacked on to Marxism. And those are all problems, don't get me wrong, but it's, first of all, not really quite getting Marx right. And secondly, it is not giving credit to what people actually experience in everyday life. I'll give you one example. Let's say we'll talk about class struggle. Oh my God, now you must be a Marxist because Marx talked about class struggle. And what are you going to do? Now you're going to be militant class warrior or whatever.
Hmm.
Uh, so that's sort of the Marxist line of that conversation, right? Or what people think is Marxism. Now, next time you go to the grocery store, you ask the employee there, or you go somewhere, go to the spa or go to the barber, you talk to people there, and you ask them, maybe not use the word class struggle, but if they experience conflict at work. And they will tell you a few things because work is full of conflict. Where's the conflict coming from? It's not workers waging any class warfare. It's basically increasing pressure on all working people, and not just the essential workers in the grocery store. I see that at the university. There's increased pressure on even senior faculty. And I mean, I'm not complaining too much about it, but you see this more and more how our work environments are really, really tense, and somebody is actually winning that battle. If you're working in any place, well, we could talk about that. So now all of a sudden, you have a sense that class struggle might be a reality of life. And it's not because Marx said it, but because people know about it, even though if they have never even heard the name Karl Marx. So the phenomenon itself has to be looked at. The next thing is, not just the question of where's the struggle, but where's the alternative. And then people think, well, Marxism means you just hate capitalism. You're just freaking mad about capitalism all the time. You're now a big anti-capitalist. You're protesting against everything and anything where money is involved. That is yet another misunderstanding of the whole thing of Marxism, because what Marx is saying is not, I hate capitalism, I wish you were dead. Marx is saying capitalism is not sustainable. That's what we're finding too, right? This is why we have an environmental crisis. This is why we have global warming. Well, why do we have global warming? Really quickly, 70+% of CO2 emissions are produced by the economic interests of 100 large corporations. Marxism or not, whatever Marx said about capitalism, people need to wake up that the problem here is not necessarily individual consumers and all that. Of course, the big corporations want to make it look that way. It's you and me, consuming too
It's
much,
not all
but they're
about
trying.
switching our straws. Come on.
Yeah. That is a good thing. Don't get me wrong. Eating less meat is a good thing. Watching your carbon footprint is a good thing. But don't forget that in the year 2000, it was British Petroleum that actually invented carbon footprint calculators so that people would be looking at themselves a lot more rather than at the corporation. So all
Clever,
of that
clever.
big structure thing, this is now, oh, this is all Marxism. As soon as, and then you talk about class analysis, it's getting worse and worse and worse. Uh, but what we're saying here is that if everyday people paid a little bit more attention to this stuff and less to the moralizing that's going on in the blame game, that would not only be helpful in terms of finding alternatives, it would also make you less tired because we're tearing ourselves apart. We're blaming ourselves all the time. And then, all the stuff, all the complaint about greed, 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 greedy individuals. Well, what is the problem here? Well, people think it's individual people being greedy, maybe CEOs being greedy, but it is the Capitalocene system in which we find ourselves. So if you're a CEO and you decide, well, tomorrow I'll be less greedy, well, you're not going to be a CEO for long. If you're a big steeple pastor who decides, well, tomorrow I'll speak up against, big money running my life and my faith and my sermons and my church, you will not be a big steeple pastor for very long. So talking about this stuff is what a lot of people think is Marxism. Oh my God. And of course, Rieger talks about all this stuff, so he must be a Marxist. But in my own analysis, I find some of the insights from Marx actually helpful, but they do not come from Marx. It's not like Marx taught me this and that. It's just what me, myself, and I, as a Christian, a disciple of Jesus, am observing and what's going on all around us. Once you see that, you
Hmm.
cannot unsee it. And whether people call that Marxism, I think it's at that point just a red herring, red baiting too. That is totally unhelpful. So if you could give that up and say, well, let's talk about the issues and let's talk about what people see. I mean, if I were the only one seeing it and I say, well, you should see it too, well, maybe don't trust me. But if you see any of the things I just listed, maybe you need to pay more attention.
Yeah, absolutely. You've said so much there that I want to unpack, and I definitely want to generally bring the conversation into how do disciples of Jesus specifically respond to this. When you were sharing about, what you might observe on the ground, like, forget Marx for a moment, but what is the replicable result of just going into a workplace, hearing their points of tension, their points of conflict, and figuring out practical on the ground solutions, it strikes me that we have a failure of what Walter Brueggemann famously coined, calls the prophetic imagination. That our imaginations are powerful things, and how we direct those in fantasy and aspiration help shape the world that we're in. And America being one of the advanced Western nations with the least amount of even social safety nets tells me that our imagination has been hijacked. We've all become, many of us in our aspirational lives have become temporarily embarrassed billionaires. And so we don't have worker solidarity in this country, because we all literally imagine one day I'm going to save up and hit it and make it good, or one day I'm going to pull myself up by those mythical bootstraps, and that then I want these tax laws in place to benefit me because I'm going to be there one day, or I'm going to strike it rich with the lottery, instead of using our imaginations to imagine a better workplace on a day-to-day basis and a more harmonious social system on the whole. And I think that part of the reason why we concentrate so much fantasy into being a billionaire is because under our current economic system, that's the amount of money we imagine that we would need to feel safe, to feel secure, to feel happy, be able to provide for each other. But as I discovered the other night over a simple meal, harvested root vegetables and other goodies, like it actually takes less to be happy, but it does take a reimagination of structure. And healthy religion is about sinking more into our present condition, accurately counting the cost. And I think the American religion and American Christianity has, not only bought into heaven after you die, but being a potential billionaire before you die.
That is so true, Mike. I think I guess I mean, did you have a question you wanted to ask, or just me comment
I
on?
was just sort of commiserating about that
Yeah,
particular element. I mean, absolutely. If you want to riff on that, and you're welcome to.
I would love to, because I mean the billionaire thing I think is really crucial. By the way, you know how you define a billionaire in terms of everyday life? It's such that your grandkids will not have to work.
Mm,
Right? I
yeah,
mean, we usually think of wealthy people, maybe the kids don't have to work, but a billionaire can make sure that the grandkids do not have to work ever for the rest of their lives, right?
hmm
That's pretty
hmm
wealthy. And of course, that is out of reach for anyone within the 99%, probably the 99.9%. We cannot make this happen. We cannot even make it happen, most of us, that our kids will never have to work, let
Yep.
alone, the boomers, the baby boomers, that's sort of still my generation, are now really getting in trouble with their retirements. And this is a generation that's still supposed to have some money. So the funny thing here is, once your generations get there, I mean, it will be all falling apart, even worse than it is now.
Yeah.
So the billionaire thing, on the one hand, is an illusion, and as a theologian, I want to say that the real tragedy is, from a theological perspective, that this is how we envision God. God
hmm
having this unlimited resources. God can bestow upon anybody anything, and God can do whatever God wants, sort of this idea of omnipotence as straight down from the sky, making things happen, top down, unilateral power, all of that. And that's, of course, not the God of Jesus Christ. That this is the God of empire. This is the Christ of empire, who sometimes plays that game too. But this is where our imagination, since you're talking about the prophetic imagination or any imagination, is totally distorted and backwards. And even well-meaning progressives, I think, unless they muster up the guts to rethink who they think is God, get sucked back into that trap. And then you say, well, maybe I don't need a billion to be wealthy. I need this and I need that to be wealthy. But that's still fooling yourself.
Yeah. And it feels as though the dominant imagination of I'm going to work really hard, labor really hard, pull myself up by my bootstraps, and then maybe I'll be able to provide for myself, for my kids, and for my grandkids. Like, first, I think we could acknowledge that that's by and large rooted into something positive. Like, we often will criticize, people for being greedy, like you said, but anymore, it feels like it's about subsistence. And And I feel like the fact that most of us are tired, that we don't feel like we have time for activism or labor organizing or reimagining our communities or even going to church anymore is a feature, not a bug, of capitalism. It does seem as though I don't want to be conspiratorial here, that there's a they there, but the system that has a life of its own, a certain intelligence of its own, what Walter Wink would call, the principalities and the powers that be, seems to want to keep us busy and exhausted. And I think that, the average person, yeah, doesn't think they have time to organize their workplace. They've probably cut out a lot of elective activities in their life, even in the last 5 to 10 years. Gosh, was it 20 years ago that the study bowling alone came into being, and we like looked at how isolated we are as a culture, and that like church attendance is in decline for similar reasons. A lot of my progressive, Christian friends will point to the very real and understandable reasons of deconstruction of belief or political disillusionment that have led a lot of conservative evangelicals to exit churches. But the reality is there are also a lot of conservative evangelicals who are still happily conservative politically and theologically, who are also not going to church. And sometimes I think secular leftists will praise this as a universally good phenomenon. It's a good thing people aren't going to church anymore. And it's like, no, no, hold on a second. Sociologically speaking, even if you're in a more conservative church, you're coming together and brushing shoulders with people who aren't in your exact demographic. You might be learning some kind of benevolence and practical aid to people, however, myopic it might be. If it's a soup kitchen or something that doesn't look at larger issues, you're still practicing some generosity, practicing some compassion. And I think that whether a conservative or a progressive leaves church, what often then happens is they're immersing themselves in the echo chambers that they can stream and listen to while driving to and from work, whether it's talk radio or a podcast or something. And we're becoming more and more siloed. And it seems as though the fruit is in and empathy is on the decline, just as we're not getting our full sensory and social needs met by getting to be out in these spaces. So again, to me, this circles back to a question of how do we reclaim margin to have community, solidarity, organizing, and even leisure in a world where free time seems to be less and less possible due to runaway inflation?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, my basic advice for anything here is really start with what you have, right? Don't try to either reinvent the wheel or have these utopian dreams. I mean, that's another problem. I think people think utopian dreams ultimately will get you anywhere, but you start with what you have. You start with the community that you have. Could be the faith community. It certainly is the work community also, where you have other people around you. Why not start organizing there? Why not start having some conversations that make sense there? Why not start bringing people together, connecting more? And so it's not just any kind of connection, but whatever connection you have, can you make that more creative, more productive, and so on. Now, that goes back to another thing I wanted to say earlier when we talked about labor. I mean, this is this weird idea that the American dream is built on people working and therefore making it to the top. Uh, the people that work the hardest in our system right now are people that work in two or three jobs that do not make it anywhere. So weird sort of thing about the American dream is that it's now an illusion, right? It doesn't really work. And it's not because work is not important, but the way we value work. We value some work not at all, and other work then gets overvalued. Um, the way back into that, I would say, is what if we started valuing work differently? In the pandemic, we talked about essential work. We realized there was some work that was really absolutely essential for our survival. Now, not only do we say job well done, and of course, what churches would do, then they would stand outside the grocery store and congratulate the grocery workers, maybe give them some flowers and some candy, which is a start in the right direction. But to say, what if we valued people's contribution more?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a way of also reclaiming community to say, well, we really need these grocery workers as part of our community, and that's productive labor. But then there's reproductive labor, the labor of women, the labor of minorities that are oftentimes relegated to these reproductive tasks where they're basically just keeping the system going. And then there's the labor of all of non-human nature, right? That also produces what we need to stay alive. In fact, in the Capitalocene book, I say this is the ultimate concern. Paul Tillich, the theologian, said only the ultimate concern is theological, and then Tillich goes into all kinds of esoteric stuff. I'm going into the labor stuff, saying we reclaim what we do every day. We give ourselves some credit. We actually value what is essential here, and maybe cut back a little bit on what's not so essential. And all of a sudden, you're reshaping not just people's agency, you're reshaping communities, you reshape who counts what in what community. I mean, that's the problem of church too, in a lot of these church communities, the people that actually are the heart of the operation, which are the essential workers there, don't count, right? The women making the coffee on Sunday morning, to stay with an old patriarchal stereotype, instead of thinking, this is where really the thing happens. And then you can revalue people in your own community. You can actually find each other, not just as, good conversation partners, but as people who are productive together, who are building something together. And then what we're doing in the Wendland Cook program, we have these solidarity circles where we put faith communities together with solidarity economy projects, and basically saying, why should the church just do the fluffy stuff and not get involved in the matter of everyday life? And once the church gets involved in everyday life, the church will not only gain more relevance, but it will be transformed. So in a nutshell, this is how I see rebuilding community, rebuilding faith communities, the value of it. But at the same time, I mean, this is maybe the final comment here. This is the way you push back against the Capitalocene. A lot of people see that the Capitalocene has produced this enormous inequality, and it's getting worse. So we're not done yet with enormous inequality, and generation X or Y and Z that's listening. I mean, you guys are even worse off than us guys, and keep that in mind. Let that sink in, and then you get the protest and say, well, there's a real misdistribution going on. We need redistribution. Well, of course we do, but how do you approach it? And for a lot of people, they get caught like the deer in the headlight with this distribution thing. I'm saying, what if we looked at the production thing? Uh, that is to say, how this misdistribution happens is that production is not valued correctly, that labor is not valued correctly. If you went back to what people do, people's agency, people's production, and you now value that differently, imagine what that would do to inequality, and imagine what that would do to redistributing some of the wealth that all of us are producing together. So that's a bunch of issues here that might not obviously be connected, but I put them out there because I think they're essentially connected. And without looking at the various pieces, churches will become emptier and emptier, and the workplace will become ever more frustrating.
Yeah. We won't even be able to congregate, to gather together if we don't look at these. And I love what you were saying about ultimate concern. And maybe I'm a weirdo who would like to see how you and Tillich could dance together in that, because I often feel that that the mystics and the activists don't talk to each other. And so, here I am on this channel with my readers who mostly pick me up because they want some insights into Christian mysticism or contemplative spirituality. And it's like, what does that have to do with these, complex labor systems and our economic models? But to me, they both have. And when I look into like Christian mysticism, whether we're talking about the 17th century German Jakob Burma or the 20th century teacher Zhi Gurdjieff, what we're often talking about in these mystical maps of reality are life cycles of interdependent arising. We're looking at, what some call the great chain of being, what Gurdjieff called the ray of creation. And it's all the ways that we are literally in a food chain and that we're all feeding each other. And the question is, are we doing it from a place of conscientious choosing and generosity, or are some elements extracting from us without our full consent, without our full participation? And as a Christian, and specifically as a Trinitarian Christian, I believe in the full participation of the Godhead and creating a reality, an imbricate order, a manifestation realm where we are also invited to participate consciously in the give and the take, the life and the death and the cycles. And I think there's just a lot of juicy space here for those of us who are pragmatically concerned with the very real material concerns of our world, and those of us who are devoted to inward looking and contemplative practice and experiencing the joys and the ecstasies that are possible in communion and chanting and spiritual practice, to say, hey, maybe we're speaking different dialects of the same core syntax of what provides for an abundant life.
I like that. Yeah, I think this is ultimately where my own work is rooted. Again, there's a lot of social analysis looking at how our lives are shaping up, but ultimately to say this is bigger than us. This is not just us either protesting, and this is why we're so tired, because we oftentimes, even though we may not say it, we act as if it were just us. We act as if somehow the whole is just the sum of its parts, without realizing there are bigger things going on. But I think this is the Capitalocene thing. One more time, even for mystics in the Capitalocene, we need to see what we're going up against, because there's sort of a Capitalocene mysticism that basically fools us into ultimately complying with the system. And then there might be some systems of resistance. I'll tell you what I mean. I mean, oftentimes people criticize contemporary life as we're also individualistic, we're also separated. This is the bowling alone theme, which is, of course, written by a sociologist who's observing social relations. But of course, the Capitalocene has this insidious thing that Americans find hard to admit, that it's also connecting us in very unhealthy ways. It's connecting people via exploiting them. It's connecting people by building your existence on the back of somebody else. And the billionaire that might claim they're the ultimate individual are actually not that. They're the most connected people on the planet because they benefit from everybody else's labor that they ever meet. So in this sense, the Capitalocene has a very deep web of connections and communities. And of course, we call that class analysis by understanding how power flows. This is not about how much money you have, but how are you connected in this web of life? And it's an unhealthy web of life. A lot of mysticism these days gets spent to reinforce this capitalist unhealthy system. This
Corporate
is what.
mindfulness practices, yeah,
Yes.
meditate during your lunch break so that you can work overtime.
Exactly. Yes, you got it. And of course, that's not just Christianity. Buddhism gets used for that too, and a lot of other stuff,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
which of course is part of the problem. So those of us who then want to reclaim Buddhist, Christian, any sort of mystical traditions, can do it more effectively and maybe more powerfully if we're sort of understanding how what we're doing is different from that. And I think it is.
Yeah.
But now I'd have to say, you cannot think yourself into something else. You also have to work and act yourself into something else. And that means maybe the spiritual practice is best celebrated, or practiced or engaged in, excuse me, not on the mountaintop, but in the streets, in the on the factory floor, in the university halls, and so on.
For
And
sure.
bringing our churches a little bit closer to reality here could help too.
That would always help. Well, let's spend our last time together kind of really diving into that question. A lot of my readers and viewers come from, a conservative evangelical background or some other high control religious environment, and they're composting their faith and their spirituality now, and they're hopefully beginning to ask these questions of how does the spiritual questions and the spiritual search they have, how does it connect to these larger practical concerns? and and oftentimes I feel like folks will abandon, jettison, deconstruct from a very consumerist version of Christianity they grew up in. Then they end up defaulting to other consumerisms, whether it's nihilism and materialist cynicism, or maybe they go into a more esoteric realm with tarot and astrology. And no shade, I actually appreciate tarot and a lot of esotericism myself, but it still ends up being this very siloed, consumeristic sort of thing. You're a person who has spent decades of life in faith communities. You're an ordained United Methodist elder, um, and you've written books about this. But if you could share, just to whet folks' appetite, how specifically has the life and the teachings and the call to apprenticeship to Jesus shaped your outlook when it comes to labor solidarity and the practical ways that we can work the mechanisms of change in our culture?
I mean, I would say this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm doing what I'm doing not because I have a preference for critiquing class and the economy or whatever, but I think this is where I find Jesus, and not just I think this is Jesus's ministry, and we should do what Jesus does, but I find the reality of Jesus in living different lives, in asking these questions, in finding alternatives. One of my teachers back in the Duke days, this is now 30 plus years ago, Frederick Herzog, used to ask this question: what is Jesus doing now? Which I think is a much better question than simply asking, what would Jesus do? And of course, it's an even better question than not asking the Jesus question at all, which I think that is one of my ongoing surprises in the evangelical world, that you're so mystifying Jesus that, of course, it's also in the creeds, right? Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed. You talk about Christ being conceived, born, died, resurrected, but you don't talk about the life and the ministry. The question here is not just what did the historical Jesus do, but what is Jesus doing now? And once you ask that question, I think everything changes,
Mm-hmm.
because you have to give an answer to it. And if your answer is, Jesus is sitting in the church praying all the time, well, that's what you're going to do. If your answer is, Jesus is walking the streets of the location where you are, hanging out in the neighborhoods where you might not want to go, talking to people that you might not want to talk to, that changes your life. So in this sense, I mean, I must say, the reason I'm doing what I'm doing is precisely because I think this is what Christianity is all about. I mean, I make a very totalitarian, very strong claim here that some people might not like, but this is the problem. We have this evangelical framework in which a lot of people are raised, and then they liberate themselves from it and they go into some liberal direction, and then it's all anything you want, rather than saying, how do we reclaim some of our old evangelical values? I mean, I grew up as a German Methodist, which is in some ways culturally very close to sort of American evangelicalism of a more conservative brand. That's how I was raised. In seminary, for a while, I became a liberal. Paul Tillich helped with that, which is fine. But ultimately, I felt it wasn't really powerful enough for anything. It didn't really move us forward. And so for me, finding sort of liberationist approaches was helpful. But I developed my own liberationist approaches then in relation to that, all the way bringing it back to this question: what is Jesus doing now? And not asking that simply intellectually, and then reading a lot of books about it, but also experientially, existentially. Where do I connect with Jesus? And the truth is, I need to say this here in public. I oftentimes find less of Jesus in the church than, say, in the Union Hall. I find less of Jesus, where Jesus is invoked a lot, and maybe more where people might not talk as much about Jesus, but actually act in certain ways. And sometimes, this is where interreligious dialogue plays a role. You may not have to convert other people to your faith. Just see how they're taking their faith seriously. Take your own faith seriously.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little piece of atheism here also. I need to say that that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, because the early Christians were accused. I deal with this in a book, Jesus versus Caesar. The early Christians were accused of atheism, not because the Romans were stupid and didn't understand, they didn't believe in, they also believed in God, but because the Romans could not deal with the God they believed in. The
Mhm.
Romans were religiously tolerant. They could believe in many gods. So adding a little God here at the end of the universe wasn't the problem. The real problem was that these early Christians believed in a God that was not recognizable as a God within the principles of theism. And so that was a badge of honor to say, your God doesn't fit here. And unless we realize this, that the God and the Jesus doesn't fit in this dominant empire religion, I think we're sort of always bound either to get stuck in the system or then simply to be totally rejecting it and constantly peddling up against it, almost like playing liberals and conservatives playing ping pong all the time without really anything being at stake and without reclaiming what that Christian God could really be. So those are some things that go into this question: how are we inspired by what's really at the core of it? I mean, the other thing, early on, you said talk about the doctrine of the Trinity. That's yet another thing. I mean, there's an empire way of reading the doctrine of the Trinity. If I can do that really quick, Mike.
Yeah, of course, you can take your
I'll,
time. I love talking Trinity nerdery, so please.
So this is another book. I mentioned the Jesus versus Caesar book. Another book I wrote earlier was Christ and Empire. And I go back to the Nicene Creed and I say, the Nicene Creed is the creed in Christianity that is sponsored by the Emperor Constantine, where Constantine basically helps the church decide that Jesus is of the same substance as God. The second person is of the same substance as the first person, which is certainly an important theological moment, but you can read that in two ways. The empire way, the way Constantine probably thought about this, was to say, first person is this emperor sitting on a throne, no question about it. Looks like any emperor, or today probably looks more like a CEO, or for some people looks like Donald Trump, right? Very powerful, very sort of pretentious too. That's the first person. And then once you declare the second person as of the same substance, you're now domesticating Jesus to look exactly like that. You also move Jesus up on a throne. You also make Jesus look like Donald Trump. And there's memes out there. I mean, people should Google this. It's just it's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. You don't
Now,
know which ones are satire and which ones are sincere because yeah, the elevation of God, King, Emperor Trump is something else, and it has been done since Rome. I just recently interviewed John Dominic Cross, and we were talking about this very thing, that the liturgical language and even the biblical language of Jesus as King of Kings, of Lords, of even the firstborn creation, etc., that those were titles that were ascribed to Caesar. That in the Greco-Roman world, divinity was a communicable attribute, and it flowed down from their like power over conceptions of divinity down to the humans who emulated those gods. And so that, yes, your point, Christianity bottom up, grassroots Christianity was intentionally subverting those titles, those names, and those roles to say no, this sort of Galilean peasant is actually our vision of what it means to be God, and therefore rewrites our conception of God rather than being a top down, being a more distributed model of God, as it were.
and so for Dom Crossan, sort of going down that road, ultimately you want to demystify Christ. You want to sort of point out that Jesus is not like that. But what Dom Crossan is not quite doing, and I think that has to be done, is to plug that really back into the doctrine of God. In other
Mm,
words, don't just demystify Christ and then leave God to some sort of mystical speculation about, whatever you want to use there. But plug that back into the first person. In other words, the first person can domesticate the second person. That was Constantine's Nicene intention.
mm,
Nicaea also opens the way for the second person radicalizing the first. In
yes.
other words, now we're not just talking about, well, Jesus is really radical, but Jesus now helps us totally not only deconstruct but reconstruct our images of God and our experiences of God, and you plug that into the mystical experience,
Mm,
and you sort of now work with a fairly high Christology where Jesus is not only human but also divine and fully divine. then all of a sudden the whole thing changes. The whole game sort of totally derails the Empire game. But it takes some nerve now for people of faith to say, this is the God to whom we're praying. This is really now the point of the Trinitarian doctrine. This is the point of spirituality, pneumatology. This is the point of um, being empowered, inspired by the Holy Spirit. That sort of stuff now is what the New Testament scholars are usually not doing. And,
Mhm.
I don't want to point fingers here. I think that's the work that has to be done. And maybe some of us theologians can help here. Unfortunately, that hasn't hit the ground either. Everybody's always excited about, let's talk about Jesus as a real radical thing. But there's a little bit more work to be done, plugging that back into the Godhead. Plus, there's also a little bit more work to be done on the Jesus end, because thinking about Jesus as a nonviolent resistor, well, okay, fine, protester, blah, blah, blah. But why don't we think about Jesus as an organizer?
Hmm.
Jesus as somebody who actually, is not only God, but God building power differently,
Hmm.
not just protesting power, but building power differently. And this is where, in the New Testament world, I think the work of Richard Horsley, Dick
Mhm.
Horsley, is actually quite helpful. Thinking about that some more. So you put it all together. I mean, this is not to say that some of these individual projects are not valuable, but they sometimes get post in ways that don't quite take us through to where we need to be going.
Yeah, so many of us are siloed and, into our own echo chambers. And you're speaking my love language, Jorg, to look at what if, God is like Jesus? What if the Abba of Jesus stands in the lineage of the Hebrew prophets and is someone who is, solidarity, who is this bottom up wellspring rather than the power over conception of the Greco-Roman gods? And yeah, what if we can take what empire may have meant in Nicene theology to solidify the rank, to say nothing about subordinationist views of the Trinity, that God is at the top and then flows to the
Uh,
Son and the Spirit, which often practically becomes the Trinitarianism of evangelicalism, even though it's technically heresy. I've even heard some Calvinists, some conservative Calvinists, be like, so because that vision of Trinity supports their model of the ideal patriarchal home, etc. And it's like, no, it may have been codified at Nicaea, but arguably the spirituality and the flow of Trinitarian thought came from Cappadocia and Turkey, from these Cappadocian mystics who very experientially intuited that there was something about the fragrance of the divine on Jesus that they wanted to express more concretely. And like you say, it flows both ways, because that our vision of Jesus and who he is and what the core of his teaching and mode of organizing is can rewrite how we see God. And I find a lot of encouragement in some of the more Christologically engaged process theology, as well as what people like Thomas Ord are talking about with open and relational theology, to say, what does it mean if maybe God is the most moved mover? And as Tripp likes to say, what if Tripp Fuller say, what if God looks like Jesus? Such good questions to consider as we look at what nourishes our inner lives for the outer work.
So putting that together with what we were saying earlier, Mike, I think that those are really good questions to be putting forward. I mean, the Trinitarian thing here is sort of the reversal of the hierarchical system. One could say, what does it mean if at the core of the universe is not the hierarchy of, God over Jesus and the Spirit, but egalitarian relationships, mutual relationships? I think this is where process theology is indeed very helpful. But if you plug that into what we said earlier, there's one more piece I think that comes back now is namely, if there's inequality and power struggles going on, where do you find God there? And so equality here doesn't quite yet get you out of the mess of inequality. And the way you see that in Jesus's own ministry is, of course, Jesus. While Jesus loves everybody, it's not the same way, right? I mean, he can yell at the Pharisees, he can turn over the tables in the temple, which I would argue, of course, is also love, or Mary can say God fills the hungry with good things. This is in the Gospel of Luke in the beginning, but God also sends the rich away empty. So this taking sides, becoming part of power struggle on the side of those who are actually exploited, dominated, and so on. Oppressed is such a generic term. I don't like to use it all the time. But on the side of the exploited, all of a sudden you find this egalitarian God. That's powerful stuff. And of course, that then gives you some advice for how to live your life. Because while it's better to have sort of some egalitarian system than a hierarchical system, I would agree, not only in church, but also in politics and certainly in economics. Imagine, right? Imagine those things. It's also important to be clear where that egalitarian thing gets hung up and where you have to take sides in the struggle.
Absolutely, something that came up over our epic dinner the other night, and even was showing up in my interview with Dom a little bit, is that many of us who may be inspired by egalitarianism and even anarchist political theory, we've tended to maybe naively have a sort of flat view of what that looks like. So that, say, in the Occupy movement, someone who maybe was camping out in a park for months and someone who just walks up both have the same right to the bullhorn and the same right to speak. And what Dom and I were talking about, summarizing, anthropological consensus, is that in immediate return forager societies and hunter-gatherer societies, where a lot of these visions of pro-social and egalitarian behavior come from, it's not as though they don't have leadership. They do. It's just that leaders are pro-social. They are rewarded by looking out for the whole, and they are specialized. So people might be a leader in one domain and not another. You might have, a shamanic medicine person, and then you might have, more of a traditional tribal leader. And they are replaceable. They are fluid, depending on the needs of the moment. And if the tribe feels like they aren't fulfilling pro-social obligations, they can be ousted if they're myopic, if they're acquisitive. And so, yeah, you're speaking to what Catholic social teaching calls God's preferential option for the poor. But there are, God is not some neutral force out there that's just sort of like, yeah, everybody just do your thing. There are these places for leaning into our strengths and honoring difference, honoring experience.
And I think that is really the key of so many things. I mean, I think it's the key of the mystical experience too, to see God not just sort of as out there, some amorphous force, but to see where God is actually engaging and to come to this point where there is this preferential option, which, to sort of Western modern ears sounds a little strange and maybe even unfair. But I remember Gustavo Gutierrez saying to me years ago, we have this preferential option for the poor, not because the poor are good, but because God is good. This is who God is, This is and if anybody has any questions, well, read the Bible. Right? This is sort of the evangelical answer to say, why don't we take the Bible actually seriously for a change? Uh,
Yeah,
Use it, work through it. And you see this in Jesus, but you also see it in Paul. That's what a lot of people don't get. Think Paul is sort of the conservative and all we can take from the New Testament is Jesus. No, Paul has this preferential option.
he sure
I mean,
does.
this is another longer conversation, but when Paul talks about the body of Christ, we're all organically related, she says. Well, the Roman Empire said that too, by the way. This is not Paul's invention, but Paul turns it from its head on its feet, basically saying, there is that preferential option. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it.
Mhm.
The members that we consider inferior, we clothe, we treat with greater honor, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and that rightly discerning the body of Christ means that it's shameful if the rich folks show up at the love feasts and gorge while some people go away hungry. Yeah, there's this very
Exactly. Yeah.
practical
Some
community
very radical.
organizing element.
Yeah.
And I think I'd like for us to wrap on that existential note. Earlier you were talking about the what would Jesus do trend that was especially prevalent in evangelicalism, I'd say in the 90s and the early 2000s. Folks were wearing the bracelets. And Part of me feels kind of misty-eyed for that era when evangelicals were actually actively asking what would Jesus do instead of
Yes.
what our God King Emperor Trump would do. The naked
Yeah.
worship of power. But you brought up such a good point that asking the question of what is Jesus doing is actually a more trusting relationship with the risen presence of Jesus, of the Christ today. In some ways, what would Jesus do is a question that almost assumes a practical atheism or a practical God. Jesus isn't actually here today, but what would he do just theoretically if he were around? But what is Jesus doing now is this opportunity to like existentially discern the body today, to discern the body of God, the presence of the risen Christ, not just in church, but in the streets, in our workplaces, in our own hearts and beings. And to see, was it Mother Teresa that said that God comes to us in some of God's most distressing disguises? Where Paula Darcy says God comes to us disguised as our life. So how, yeah, can we discern that presence of Jesus today and cooperate with it?
That is, I think, the challenge of Good Friday and Easter. We're sort of heading that direction now. And if you think about it, yeah, I mean, claiming the resurrection is really not only claiming that Jesus is somehow alive again, but also present. So this idea of Jesus sitting at the right hand of God on a throne, waiting till the sound of the final trumpet, is a little odd, if you really think that Jesus is God, and that Jesus has an impact. But I mean, let me just back up here. I really appreciate even the people that were asking, and hopefully still some are asking the question, what would Jesus do? Because that seems to be not even a question anymore. In those days, we would have some facetious questions like, what would Jesus drive, right? What car?
Yep.
Pickup truck, because he was a carpenter, I mean, that's just joking around. But one of the questions that was raised about 20 years ago was, in the Iraq War, who would Jesus bomb?
Yes.
And you apply that now to what's happening in Gaza. And I think if one asked that question, one would really have to say, would Jesus bomb the Palestinians? Well, big question mark. Now, that's already a difficult question to answer. But now ask the
Is it?
question in the present. Who is Jesus bombing? So Jesus is dropping on. I mean, that is, once you get to that point, I think one really has to draw a line and say, is my faith actually life-giving or is it death-dealing? I often start theology classes by asking this question. Um, how do you think theology is a matter of death and life? And people laugh and they think, well, this is the professional theologian asking questions about people appreciate his field. No, this is talking about how faith is actually deadly to people. And maybe asking the question in the present tense, what is Jesus doing here, would be more helpful than a lot of the other stuff that we're doing right now, and to do it in a contemplative way. So this is not just me as the academic sort of having some very smart responses, but this is sort of the everyday, work of the Christian life, figuring out, am I becoming more like Jesus? Now, as a Wesleyan, of course, this is the whole question of holiness and sanctification. Is there some transformation happening in me? And I'm a theologian still, with some excitement, even though I see a lot of problems with my field, because I think my field helps us answer some of these questions. Do that for myself every day. I hope we can help faith communities. This is what we're doing with the Wendland Cook program and the Solidarity Circles, basically trying to ask these questions in a way that's accountable, that really is accounting to that reality, which is bigger than us, and really taking it seriously.
Absolutely. Yeah, theology matters in ways that we don't realize. Something that Richard Rohr and I wrote about in The Divine Dance, The Trinity and Your Transformation, that became relevant again with this past summer's blockbuster movie, is that, this outgrowth of the Nicene top-down flavor of Trinitarianism that you're speaking of finds one of its apexes in Oppenheimer literally naming, his atomic bomb test Trinity. And it's the ultimate, sort of grotesque example of creative power that is turned awry. And imagine if we had more people with this Cappadocian understanding of Trinity, this distributed and shared power and solidarity understanding of Trinity. Absolutely matters. And I'm, so grateful for the work that you're doing, both, yourself personally and with the Wendland Cook program. So I do hope people go to religionandjustice.org, isn't it? And
That's the website. Yes.
yeah,
Thanks, Mike.
we'll have that in the notes. We'll also have, the theology and the Capitalocene, ecology, identity, class, and solidarity in the notes. Is there anything else you want to let my viewers know about how they can connect with you and your work further?
So this Wendland Cook program in religion and justice at Vanderbilt, we're really trying to do all kinds of things. I mean, definitely work that's valuable for churches. So if anybody's interested in joining a solidarity circle, we'll be starting some more cohorts this fall. So far, we've had about 100 churches participating, and we hear some really good stories. Maybe this is another emergence after the emergence. We'll see. But you can help us test it out. That's one thing. I mean, we're also doing academic work. I mean, I'm not frustrated at all about what the Theological Academy can do. So check us out for that. I mean, we're having students. If you're interested in studying with us, we're doing lay education, various kinds of things. The other thing that's really important for us is international work. So we really have to realize that this goes all the way back to our conversation that we cannot do this by ourselves. This has to be this broader solidarity. And oftentimes we learn something from people outside of the US. Which is so strange. We are the superpower now in the US, but we're strangely insular. Our theology is insular. Our Christianity is insular, without actually learning much from others. So that's another thing that we do, sort of maybe just advertising that a bit. And then the final thing that's also important here that we didn't talk about much is to think about our work interreligiously. So, I mean, obviously, I'm working my work as a Christian theologian, very much committed to what Jesus is doing now. But that doesn't mean that we have to be now triumphalistic and think only Christianity has it. In fact, as you work through these struggles with other religious friends, you become aware of what is that moves them. You develop some respect, you develop some curiosity. You can talk about that then in the struggle, of course. This is not interreligious talk about how interesting things are, but being engaged together, working together, those kinds of things, then strengthen each of the religious components, make you a better Christian eventually. If you're not a Christian, make you maybe a better atheist, or a better Buddhist or
Mhm.
something like that. That can
Yeah.
happen also. I'm going on and on here, but I really appreciate working with you, Mike, because I very much appreciate the work that you have done over the years, sort of bringing mysticism into the conversation, helping people understand that there's some real vitality when we talk about religion. So thanks for that.
Absolutely, Jorgen. We'll have to do this again because you're right. There's so much more we can unpack. I've certainly learned a lot in the last dozen years, primarily connecting with various Muslim communities and seeing absolutely the kinds of solidarity and interdependence that we can build together. So what I love hearing about the Wendland Cook program is it's not only for folks looking at maybe secondary degrees and education, although that's certainly there, but there are ways for lay folks and entire congregations to get involved. So definitely get to religionandjustice.org to see all those juicy possibilities and check out Jorg's books. We're going to have some linked in the show notes, and by all means, let's keep on engaging together to build a more hopeful, interdependent world rooted in rhythms of rest, so that we can really be at this for the long haul and that we can experience the abundant life that Jesus promises in the here and now. Thank you, Jorg.
Thank you, Mike.